And I went back home and I sat down on the sofa with my mum, and then the local BBC East Midlands News came on, and it said 2 men from the Meadows had been arrested on suspicion of murder. And I was just like, she just looked at me and said, "That's not you, is it?" And that's how she found out.
Obviously, we've met you before, but for any new watchers or listeners, can you just give a brief introduction to yourself and who you are?
My name's Jacob Dunne. I'm 30 years old. I'm an author, a father, and campaigner on a few social issues that are close to my heart. Mental health, mainly men's mental health, criminal justice. Perhaps what I'm most well known for is for raising awareness around One Punch after throwing a punch back in 2011, which sadly ended another person's life.
Well, I mean, let's get back to the very beginning of it all. Like, can you just tell us a little bit about your childhood and what growing up was like?
I grew up in inner city neighbourhood in Nottingham, council estate called the Meadows, which I love and hate at the same time. Your typical kind of upbringing, to be honest. I was part of a very loving family. My mum tried to send me to primary schools outside of my neighbourhood, and through going to church in other areas and stuff like that, she was able to manage to get me to a primary school that was outside of my the area I grew up in.
Is that because she didn't want you to go to school in that area?
Yeah.
Right.
She always kind of felt like if I'm going to give him the best chance, then I'll try and get him into a school.
Sure.
Not in that area, which she did. And looking back, it was a great decision. Enjoyed it. It was kind of just a free spirit. I had a good childhood, really good childhood. My mum and dad split up when I was about 7 years old. So what's that, like year 4 in primary school. And because everything was so settled in my routine and I was happy at school or wherever, I don't think I really paid much attention to it. Although it was quite a messy divorce, unfortunately. And I do remember at times feeling like I was made to pick a side. Particularly as a young lad, mummy's boy, it was easy to take her side. And
yeah.
Obviously he was working a lot, 7 days a week a lot of the time as well, so I didn't really have the strongest relationship with him anyway, which meant that after they got divorced and he moved back to his family home area in Manchester, that I didn't see him again. I think it was about, I saw him again at 10, and then the next time I saw him after that was, I think it was about 16.
And was that because of your parents falling out?
Yeah, that was just the way that they'd fallen out. And as I said, I was kind of made to feel a little bit like I had to pick sides.
Right.
Which was a flaw on my mum's part. And then, yeah, it was just really messy, like social services, not social services, but like contact centres to like build relationships, and like me and mum would be running away. Right. And he'd be there like wanting to see his son. And, you know, me and mum would be just like running off. Or
I mean, at that point, did you not want to meet him? Did you see him?
At that point, I kind of just felt like it was just too much drama.
Yeah.
I hadn't really built up a solid relationship with him. He lived far away. So it was easier at that age to just continue with my school friends. My mum still like put me in loads of after school clubs and activities and stuff. And I guess it wasn't until I kind of got into my teens that I guess I needed someone that could keep me in check a little bit more around. I guess that's when I started to realise, you know, I wasn't complaining because I could push the boundaries more with my mum and get away with more, you know, not going to school and skiving, getting into trouble, getting arrested.
And do you think your dad would have been more of a firm hand?
I think my dad would have just been more like lay down his expectations more. But unfortunately, because he wasn't there, he didn't have the legitimacy. And so it took a very long time for us to kind of heal that relationship and get to a point now where we can challenge each other legitimately, and we've built up that trust between us. So yeah, it just kind of all went tits up.
Sure. And what age is this now?
This going into secondary school, so about 10.
So still quite young.
Yes, it's still quite young.
Right.
Because I see it even today, just that transition from primary school to secondary school is huge for any young person, because you go from child to teenager, don't you? And all of a sudden, maybe you've got allowed a mobile phone now, you're allowed to, go out with your mates a bit more, you've got that little bit more independence and freedom. But what comes with all that is that social anxiety of like wanting to fit in.
Well, that's when you're that age, if you find a thing that makes you popular, you just hit that button over and over again.
Yeah. Oh, right, yeah.
They like
everyone
it.
And it's like, okay, I'll just keep busting joke. But I remember in year 7, when one of the, not long into my first year at secondary school, and the teacher was like, we're going to ring your mum. And I was petrified.
Right.
I was like, oh, shit. Oh, my lads say it.
Yeah.
And I was like, really worried about what my mum's response was going to be. And then, I just realised after that I could start pushing the boundaries more and
because
more.
There wasn't much...
Because there wasn't really...
comeback from it.
Yeah, much comeback from it. And she was someone who would often try and make excuses for me as well. Like, oh, really? Like, my son behaving like that? Do you know what I mean? And I could play her against the teachers. Do you know what I mean? So then I just started to become a bit more manipulative about it. And
so the sense of consequences are starting to
the sense of consequences are starting to fade away. I'm becoming a little bit more popular. I'm losing interest in actually applying myself at school. So just started pushing the boundaries, disrespecting more and more people. I wouldn't say I was aggressive. I was just more of like wanting to have as much joke as I could and keep pushing the boundaries. And it just become a very gradual slope into criminality, because there was generation after generation of people that had been going to the school who were all on the same trajectory and who all had the same attitude towards education, because we didn't have role models in our estate to look up to that had become lawyers or had applied themselves and become doctors or were positive role models in the community.
And when did you say that criminality? What kind of criminality are we talking about at that point?
At that point, when I'm still in school and I've not quite been kicked out yet, it's possession of drugs, recreational use of drugs, antisocial behaviour in and out of school, bits of arson.
Wow, really?
Just like in the park.
Yeah, sure.
I mean, like
bins or whatever.
You set a bin on fire or something, or I'm just getting chased by the police. And then it just became this reoccurring, because we were getting chased by the teachers, and then we slowly get kicked out of there, and then we're just getting chased by the police. And all of a sudden it's just this continual game of fighting the system. But what no one tells you is that you have to become a part of it at some point, or you're just going to be marginalised and kicked to the curb. And the longer you're in it, the longer you're fighting the system. What I tell young people now is you've got to play the system. You can't just fight the system, because you'll be fighting it forever till you're in the grave.
Did you say you get kicked out of school?
Yeah.
So what led up to that, and what age was that?
I got kicked out of school end of year 9 going into year 10. It wasn't for anything specific. It was just a build-up. They tried giving me report books, getting it signed by every teacher in every classroom. I had senior members of staff that would just follow me around.
No, right, yeah.
And just...
And at that age when that's happening, are you embarrassed about that, or is it kind of badge of honour that you're the worst one, you know?
Yeah, it is almost like a badge of honour because you're all like comparing which one of us has got the most attention on it, or which one's got the most rules being applied to us. And unfortunately, I used to have all these meetings. My mum would come up to school in all these meetings, and they'd all be discussing what I needed, but without me even in the room.
So no one was actually saying to you...
So no one was actually saying, that, Jacob, what's the cause of this behaviour? Even though I probably wouldn't have been able to answer it first time round, but it's just that approach of actually including me in the conversations instead of doing punishment to me. They should have been doing it with me. I ended up being diagnosed with ADHD, you know, like mild autism spectrum and stuff like that.
And when you heard that, were you like, oh, right, that's something, or were you just like, I don't agree?
But again, this is the point again, is it wasn't explained to me. It wasn't done with me. It wasn't, so this is what this means. There's all these amazing people out there that have ADHD, but are able to express themselves healthily. You know, this is some of the resources and tools that they use to keep themselves safe or to manage their symptoms or whatever. It was just, it seemed like it was just a tick boxing exercise so that schools and whoever else could go, okay, that's why we can't control him.
Okay, yeah.
That's what it seemed like to me. It still feels like that was the case.
I never get... Also, what's meant to happen then? So you're out of school, but how are you meant to continue your kind of progress through education? Are you meant to do it at home after that, or what's the...
Well, then they kept trying to get me into different schools.
Right.
Because my GCSEs had already kind of started, not many schools wanted to let me in. So I was out of school for about a year, then got into a new school for my last year of education. But I'd already been out on the streets for a year, throughout year 10, by that point, and was told that I had these labels that I had no understanding of. So I was just like, fuck it then. If you're going to tell me that I've got these problems, and those problems mean that I can't learn, then why am I going to try? So then it became a useful excuse.
And you said before that when you were younger you weren't aggressive. Was aggression starting to manifest in you?
That was starting to manifest in me, just for all those reasons, I guess. And then kind of just moulded me into someone who was perfectly situated to be groomed by my peers and older people on my estate.
And what does groomed mean in this situation?
In this situation, sometimes when you think of the word, when someone uses the word groomed, you think like a deliberate, like they've groomed that person and exploited them, you know, with intent. A lot of the time I feel like me and my friends groomed each other in the beliefs and the values that we had in terms of street code,
right? In
terms of, well, this is like the most controversial one, which is like snitching, which is, you know, you don't do it. Although now, you know, in my story later on, people have snitched on me and I've forgiven them, and I don't think that's a useful value to hold, especially if it means that you're going to go to prison for 20, 30 years for someone else.
But where are these rules coming from? Are they being generated within your group, or are they coming down from older people who are already in there?
It's a bit of both. It's the group and their families, and then the wider community as well.
So you're in this position, as you're describing very, very eloquently. How long is it before the event that we're going to spend quite a lot of time talking about?
So I'm about 16, 17 now. The event happens not long into my 19th birthday. So we're a couple of years down the line, really. So not far at all. And I guess what happens around this time as well is that I started experimenting more with drinking. And then a little bit later on, as I started getting introduced to some more older people, cocaine as well.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when the violence just went off the scale, because I've got all that unprocessed anger as to who I even am and where I fit in the world and what I'm ever going to amount to. And then it's all coming out when I'm getting drunk, and it's all coming out in all my mates as well.
And did you like it at that point? Did it feel like a thrill?
It was the adrenaline rush. It was just it was like, oh, Friday night, didn't have no money. We could end up like, a couple of us chipping in for a big bottle of vodka.
Yeah.
And then, it was a mess, to be honest. But there's always a couple of you in the group who would just start a fight, or they'd just run up to someone and start punching them.
And did you get beaten up at those points as well, or was it more like you were running into things and getting away, sort of mischief?
Yeah, it was mischief stuff, but I was getting, getting bottled and...
God. It's quite terrifying the way the violence is quickly spiralling out from some lads messing about, playing computer games or whatever, and then hanging around the state, and suddenly it's like the violence has appeared.
You're making enemies everywhere you're going. And people remember who you are and stuff like that. So it's like, you stood outside a bar, and then next thing you know...
Well, when you're describing, rules around not being snitches and all that kind of thing, it's building a situation where the community you have is the bond that you've got, and everyone outside that is basically not part of it, isn't it?
Yeah.
So it's for you to say, oh, don't do that to that guy, none of us know.
Yeah.
It could be seen as a betrayal.
Be seen as, almost a betrayal. It'd be like, or they won't trust you.
Yeah.
They'll be like, oh...
You're not joining in.
Or they won't invite you out next time.
And do you think when you're talking about you having unprocessed anger is what you said, do you think that's what your mates had too, but for different reasons? Or do you think some of them just enjoyed it and some of them were just going through a weird growth period? Or do you think that a lot of you had issues that was making violence appear? Yeah, I think a lot of us had issues like that. I think the majority of us didn't have fathers around or that were present in our lives. We'd all failed in school, just being kicked out of school or not getting any GCSEs and stuff like that can be quite shameful. No one's really got each other's best interests at heart, because you're all actually trying to make each other do more riskful things or put each other in more harm's way. So yeah, sometimes I feel like we say that we're brothers and that we'll ride or die, but yeah, you just got to put me in the grave quicker, to be honest. And I wish someone had kind of opened my eyes to that a little bit earlier on. And the relationship with your mum, what was that like at that point? The relationship with my mum was very strained because she didn't know she didn't know how to manage me. And it had gone on for so long that I kind of just doing whatever I wanted, really. And that's one of my biggest regrets, is the way I treated her throughout my teenage years, because she was the only one that actually had my back. What it sounds like you're saying in the kind of like, in the chronology of your life, is that the night that the event happened doesn't seem like it would have been anything out of the ordinary. No, it was just an ordinary day. It was an ordinary day. Even the event itself, you're talking about walking around town. But can we get into that now, how that happened? So it was my mate's birthday, and he was one of the youngest in the group, turned 18. So we were all like, oh, yes, you can finally come out with us, you know what I mean? He was like born in August, I think, which is like the end of the schooling year, yeah. There was a big, massive group of us. And I remember as we were walking to town, there was people in the group saying stuff like basically, oh, we're all going to get into a fight tonight. That would be common, unfortunately, as we... Excited about it? Yeah, like excited about it. Oh, if anyone starts on us lot, you know what I mean? And you're all fucking a bit drunk and you're all just acting a bit stupid. Went to quite a few bars because there's such a big group of us and you're all young and don't know how to handle your drink. We all ended up scattered all over the city centre, which was common, and then we'd usually all meet up like 2-3 in the morning. But yeah, we was all mingling around, and I actually I weren't mingling around. Some of my friends were mingling around, and they started getting into trouble.
So they called me. I was in a bar that was still just closing up. And me being the person that I am and the values that we just talked about that I had back then, they wanted my help. They said that there was trouble starting. So can you obviously come and help us out? So me being the person that I was, instantly just went running down to where they were. Didn't ask, what are you lot even doing? Like, who are you arguing with? Why are you arguing? But I did see one of my friends who was like squaring off with someone. But I think he was being the aggressor. My friend was being the aggressor. And then he got pulled away, if I can remember rightly. And then I just decided that it was my responsibility to hit that person and throw a punch at that person. And then I ran away straight away because I didn't really know what had happened, but I knew that he'd like fell to the ground. So my instant reaction was to just make a run for it because I was in the middle of Nottingham city centre. So I just ran away, realising, I think what I realised that in that moment is that I didn't actually want to hurt the guy. I was just throwing a punch for like credit from my friends or to just make a point in front of my friends. My friends came round the next day and knocked on for me at my mum's house. I came to the bathroom window, I looked out down and they were like, oh yes, Jacob, like one punch, like you knocked that guy out one punch, like basically boosting my ego and trying to like give me praise.
So at this point, did you have any guilt, or was it more just like, yeah, the night ended well, I've like done all this stuff, my friends think I'm a legend?
Yeah, well, I think by the next morning, I just thought, oh, because I'd seen that many fights and been punched or bottled and knocked over myself or whatever, that it was all just a bit of a laugh. And then I guess there's a window from then to when I actually found out what happened. And that window was about a month. I think it was about 2 weeks later. My mum had already booked us a week's holiday in Tenerife, which I guess was my last family holiday that I had with my little brother and my mum. And it was actually really nice. It was like one of the first times in a long time where it was just me, my mum. We're not in the Meadows. We're in a different country, and I guess it started to make me realise a little bit that I'd taken it for granted in the years previously. And we were in this hotel in Tenerife watching the London riots, and my mum was like, "Oh, I'm glad you're not in the UK because you'd probably end up joining that, wouldn't you?" I was just like, oh, I don't know. But I was watching, I was like, fucking hell, it's going crazy back in the UK. And obviously the riots did spread to Nottingham, Manchester, Birmingham, and wherever else it spread to, which is important to note because when I got back from Tenerife, I can't remember how long it was, but it wasn't long, and the police raided my mum's house. I wasn't in, but when they raided the house, they were going through all my clothes drawers and like going through all my kind of belongings and everything. And so my mum thought, oh, they think he's part of the Nottingham riots because they're looking for clothes or stolen goods or whatever it is. And my friends were like calling me and saying that lots of my friends who I was out with that night, a month earlier, they were all being arrested. But it hadn't got to me what they were actually being arrested for. I ended up finding out just as the police called me off my mum's phone number
Oh, right.
when they were
you
in the
s-
house.
So you saw your mum's phone number.
So
and you
someone
answered.
phones, and I answered it. It was the landline number. I don't think anyone uses landlines anymore. But, so I've answered it, and it's like, oh, it's the police. I'm like, oh my God. And like, oh, can you just come and hand yourself in at the police station, please? You got nothing to worry about. We're just following up on an investigation. I kind of had a sense then, by this point, what had supposedly happened. So I went down to the police station to actually find out for sure what was actually going on. And because going on the run or whatever was just pointless. So I went and handed myself in at the police station. And that's when I found out that I was being arrested for murder, and that punch that I threw had led to James's death, because he'd, not necessarily from the punch itself, but because he'd fell back and hit his head, got a fracture on the skull, and had passed away, I think it was 7 or 9 days later in hospital from those injuries. I feel disrespectful sometimes saying the man that I punched, but at the same time I don't know whether to refer to him directly. Sometimes, as I'm talking about these things, sometimes I just don't know
You mean by
what
his
the
name?
right, by his name. I don't want to be insensitive to anyone. I'm sure it could offend someone either way, whether I do or I don't, because I want to honour him. Everything that I've done has been to, honour him.
How do you process that at that age? Because you've gone from having a holiday that you really enjoyed, starting to rebuild a relationship with your mum, come back, not sure what's going on, and then basically being arrested for probably the most serious crime. What was going on?
To be honest, it was just pure panic, anxiety, unimaginable levels of stress, and just felt like a constant panic attack, to be honest, like a prolonged panic attack. I guess at that point I was trying not to think about the person that I had punched and their family, just because like my world was crumbling down, and I don't think I had the ability to even think about other people at that moment.
And how does it work with, say, telling your mum? Do the police call her and tell her, or do you have to call her and tell her?
Well, what happened, they kept me in the police cells for as long as they're allowed, but they still wasn't sure whether it was me or someone else that threw the punch.
Did you remember at this point?
I remembered at this point, yeah. But they still weren't sure whether it was me or my other friend who had been arrested for the same charge. So while they were still gathering evidence, because they still had like witnesses to go and find and other friends that they hadn't found yet, so they released me on bail for a day. And I went back home and I sat down on the sofa with my mum. It was obviously like, she was a childminder, for like the last 10, 15 years of her life. Was a really good childminder. But all the devices had been taken out of the house, and like the house was upside down and whatever else. She was just like, what have you done, Jacob? What have you done? And she always used to think, again, how I mentioned in school, she'd come up with an excuse for me or something. And she'd be like, oh, you're not covering up for your mates, are you? And just like telling me to like tell the truth or whatever. And then the local BBC East Midlands News came on, and it said 2 men from the Meadows had been arrested on suspicion of murder. And I was just like, she just looked at me and said, that's not you, is it? And that's how she found out. She didn't take it very well at all. She was like, freaking out, convinced that I didn't do it, convinced that I was covering up for my mates. The next day, they'd gathered some more of my friends' statements, and then they'd found all the girls that were out that night, and they'd like been and raided their houses and got interviews of all of them. And so now there was quite a few statements saying that it was me that did it.
And how did that feel? Because at that point in time, as you discussed earlier, you had this big thing around no snitching. So this has happened and your friendship group is starting to... Did you see that as snitching? As you?
Yeah, of course. I was like fuming.
Yeah.
I had the statements. I was walking around my neighbourhood to all the so-called man them and saying, look at what these men have been writing. They're all snitchers.
And what were people saying?
Well, some of them were just like, oh, like not really interested, which made me think, well, what have I been believing in then? And other people were bereaved and angry about it. But I was having to be in my house, my mum's house, from 7 o'clock. And with a woman that was slowly losing her mind. With the news that she'd been told about her son and his inevitable trip to prison. And I was losing my mind, just living with her, and I couldn't leave the house. It already felt like I was in prison, to be honest, and by that time I was on tag for 2 months waiting sentencing. I think I had to get my bail. Tag address moved to a friend's house because it had become so toxic living at home.
Wow.
And because I was basically saying to the police, look, just take me to prison now or I'm going to breach my conditions. Like I'd rather just get this over with and not be in limbo.
And were you pleading guilty or not guilty?
Yeah, well, I pled guilty when it was dropped to manslaughter and when there was overwhelming... Up until that point, I was just following my solicitor's advice that, you know, you say nothing until...
You're presented with
the charge. Presented with whatever evidence there is and what's happened. But unfortunately, because of that snitching element of the evidence, I still wasn't taking accountability. I was still more interested in... I guess I felt like a victim.
Was there an element as well in there... Because I guess it wasn't your fight, right? You did it to help your friend. You'd run across town to help your friend. So was there an element of like, I did this for you and now you've fucked me over, basically?
Yeah, in ways, yeah. And I guess all of that in itself challenged my view of the culture that I had put all my eggs in. And it continued to when I went into custody. Because, you know, then you think that your friends are going to write to you or they're going to visit you or whatever, and you just realise that we're actually all just enabling each other. We're not actually good friends. We don't actually care. Do you know what I mean? As long as you're around to go out on the weekends, that's as deep as the relationship really goes.
So you were taken... So you came to your trial, time came to your trial after, did you say 2 months it took?
Yeah, 2 months.
2 months. And...
Then I went for sentencing, as you say.
Yeah.
Went to court, not knowing what to expect. My solicitor's telling me you should expect for manslaughter, one-punch manslaughter, anywhere from, what's it, about 2.5 to like 6-7 years, something like that. So in my mind, I was like, right, I'm getting 6 years or whatever. Trying to just mentally prepare myself. Also, I'd never been in prison. Didn't really know what to expect. Although I had a lot of friends and elders in my area that had, and they were all like, make sure you plug as much drugs as you can, or make sure you don't let no one take you for a dickhead.
You scared?
Which is all kind of quite daunting.
Yeah, of course.
You're like, because I come from a good home, non-criminal background home. Do you know what I mean? And without any males in my family either. I was raised by my mum, her twin sister, and my nan. So other than the friendships that I had, I hadn't really been exposed as much as some of my other friends to some of these parts of this life. And so, yeah, it was very daunting. I wouldn't have admitted it at the time.
Of course.
And even when I was in prison or just after come out of prison, I wouldn't have admitted it. But now, as a grown man, I'm not afraid to admit when I've done wrong, let alone when I've been scared in the past. Yeah, very daunting. Just not knowing what to expect. And then I knew that the family of the man I punched were in the courtroom as well. So when I got into the courtroom, I just sat in the dock and just looked at my feet. I didn't dare make eye contact with anyone because I didn't know who was who.
And you said you'd prepared in your mind for 6 years. What was the sentence in the end? In
the end, I got the lowest, which was 2.5 years. But because I was so absent in the courtroom, I didn't even know how long I got. I got took down to the holding cells, getting ready to go in the sweatbox to prison. And I had to ask one of the guards, I said, oh, how long did I get? And they said, oh, I think you got 30 months, 2.5 years. I don't want to say happy, but I was relieved, I guess, that it was the lower half of that. There was still a part of me that was like, well, I've still got to do the time. I've still got to go to prison. I don't know what to expect. Just one day at a time was my mentality, to take one day at a time.
And what was it like in prison?
It was like being back in school, to be honest. It's like no one's grown up. And no one has, because they've all got kicked out of school and then carried on, vaguely speaking, with the same class clown antics and, easily offended, always looking for drama.
Was it threatening?
Yeah, it was definitely threatening. It was like school, but more hostile, if that makes sense. It's like everyone had grown up, but they still had that kind of kiddie mentality. But everyone was grown up and much more willing to use violence now.
And at that point, how did you feel in yourself? Like, did you feel angry? Did you feel sad? Did you feel like you said earlier, you felt like a victim? Like, what was your kind of feeling about yourself and your role in it?
Well, unfortunately, if anyone asked me in prison what I did, I'd tell them what I did. But then I'd tell them that the reason I was in prison was because someone snitched on me. Or people snitched on me. And then I just knew instantly, because I already know what their values are, that they're just going to reinforce my values. So I was never going to be held accountable by anyone in there, because the way I told my story, which is the opposite to what I'm doing today, is, what I used to do is just minimize and not take accountability for anything I did, and emphasize any areas where I could defer that accountability to somebody else. And because I was in a cohort of people in prison where they all have those same negative values and, criminal mindsets, which is sometimes why I think, well, how do you expect people to change and take responsibility in prison when they're surrounded by people who hold unhealthy ways of thinking? And on top of that, you're told when to get up, you're given your meals, you're stripped of all responsibility in the regime, and you're stripped of any people around you that could try and foster some responsibility within you. So I think it's probably the worst place to send someone. Although I don't want to come up here and tell you that there's a better option, but what I would say is that it is the worst place to send someone if you want them to take responsibility.
Were you letting guilt in at this point, or were you kind of closing it all out?
I was closing it all out.
Yeah, because even there it's interesting when you'd say you were in prison because people snitched, not in prison because of the action that caused the snitching.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. So I'm still not wanting to take accountability. And there was only one time in the whole of my prison sentence where I was offered a window to take responsibility. There was 2 attempts by the prison, but there was only one where I actually did. And the one where I actually did was, it was on the anniversary of James's death. And the vicar from the chaplain, without me knowing, came to come and let me out of my prison cell and reminded me that it was that day and asked me if I wanted to go somewhere quiet to like say a prayer. Yeah, I went down to the chaplain, which is away from the prison wing and wherever else. And it was just, that was the first time I was able to think about him without instantly dismissing it out of my mind. Yeah, my mum used to take me to church all the time when I was little until I was old enough to say no.
Yeah.
I'm not necessarily a practicing person of faith now, although I live my life as if I was, if that makes sense, you know. But yeah, he offered that kind of safe space without kind of trying to shame me.
So what led to, am I right in thinking you went through like a restorative justice? Is that how it's said, restorative justice?
Yeah.
What is it, a system or a process? Or?
I'd say, yeah, it's either a process or a conference.
Okay. Can you explain what it is exactly?
Yeah, so I got out of prison, and about 2 months after, I couldn't move back in with my mum. So I was like sofa surfing.
Because of your relationship, or was that part of the...
Because of our relationship,
right.
And yeah, just for like various reasons really. I was like, I just want to try and get on my own feet. Obviously I didn't have any qualifications, didn't have a CV, didn't have any fixed address, didn't have an email address, didn't have a bank account. And so I was just like at my probation officer's office, trying to get as much support as I could in those first couple of months. And then 2 months after getting out, I went to go see my probation officer, and she said, Jacob, have you ever heard of something called restorative justice? And I was like, no, what is that? And then she basically told me that it's where a victim and a perpetrator, or you could say that someone that's been harmed and someone that's committed the harm, get brought together to have a conversation about, you know, what happened between you two, between those parties, and that it's voluntary. It has to be voluntary from both parties to enter into it, and that the parents of James had requested to make contact with me and whether I was open to speaking with them as part of this restorative justice process. I went away for a week. I didn't want to make like a rash decision. I said I'd think about it, and it wasn't something that I necessarily wanted to do, but it was something that it felt like the right thing to do. I felt like it almost like felt like I had some sort of power over them because I had answers to questions that they had, and I was the only person that had them, and I didn't want to hold that over them.
You know, the story you've told up until now, it's, you know, sounds like a, you know, one we've heard a lot about, a young, angry man, you know, feels attacked by the world. It surprises me that you'd come to that conclusion a little.
I know. I think there was always something there wanting me to find a lifeline. I didn't think I was going to benefit from it. I just felt like it was the least I could do. And whether it would help them or not, I don't know. But I was just like, well, if you're telling me that they have questions and I'm the only one that can answer them, then I don't want to be walking around with them and not offering that back to them. That's the least I can do, surely. From the start, though, they said that they weren't willing to speak to me face to face, like straight away. And they said that they'd maybe consider meeting me face to face in 10 years' time, which would have been around now. But that they wanted to first just ask me some questions. Because what had happened...
Like written questions?
Yeah, written down questions. So what they did is they would ask them loads of questions, the practitioners, and get lots of information from them. Then they'd come to me, once I said yes, with those questions, and present them to me. And it was things like, I don't know, had I ever done like boxing or any martial arts training? Questions around what happened that night. Had he spilled a drink on me or looked up my gill or, you know what I mean, all the other, you know, what people think are normal reasons for fighting, which aren't normal reasons for fighting. And that's when I had to come to terms with, as we've already mentioned, the reason why I did actually do it. And I felt so ashamed telling them that I'd punched their son because my friends had called me up and I didn't really know why. I had no excuse, basically. We continued like that for about 6 months, just passing back and forth through the mediators, our conversations and correspondence. And what's also important to note is that the parents did, in some way, have a more punitive response to me initially, because they had appealed to the courts and to the government for me to get a harsher sentence. But because the judge had given me a sentence that was within the sentencing guidelines, it got refused. And so when they went back to their police liaison officer, support officer, and that was rejected, this police officer said, well, the only other option I can think of is restorative justice. I don't know if he'll say yes to it or whether you would get anything from it, or if anybody will get anything from it, but that is an option. And that's when they considered going down this restorative justice route, which is sitting around a table and using dialogue as a way of resolving your emotions and things that you're ruminating about. Or once I'd answered all their questions, I guess they then didn't want me to, in an ideal world, to just answer all their questions and then just carry on living the life that I was living. That wouldn't have been justice. That would have been a waste of my life and everything else. So they started to ask me questions like, what are you going to do with your life? And I was completely unprepared for those questions. I was like, oh my gosh. Because remember, when I first went into it, I only wanted to do it to help them. You know what I mean? I wasn't really thinking about me gaining anything from this or moving on in a positive way. Well, if they want me to do it, then no one else's opinion should matter. You know what I mean? No, someone says, because my friends would be like, oh, because what I ended up telling them is that I was going to try and do my GCSEs again. I was like 21, 22 now. And I said, well, I don't know what I can do, but maybe I'll have another shot at my GCSEs again. So my probation officer helped me start trying to do my GCSEs again. And what I realised is that I guess the people that I had harmed the most were the ones that were judging me the least. Cut a long story short, I ended up getting an A star in English, an A star in psychology, and I got a C in maths, which I was very proud of. And all of a sudden, I loved education. I could not believe that I was sitting there passionate about education and actually being able to learn new information, actually reading a book. I read my first book when I went and did my GCSEs, The Great Gatsby. And I was still corresponding with David and Joan, but it was just, at this point, I was just saying to them, I'll keep you posted on how my studies go. Because I'd answered all their questions. I didn't really want much else from me in that respect, just other than, can you keep us posted on how you're doing and your progress? And so, yeah, when I finished my GCSEs, I wrote them a letter, and I was just like, I've done this, and and my plan is to do I did an access course after that in higher education, in social sciences, and I passed that with distinctions. And then within 2 years, I was in a position to go to university, any course I wanted, really. And I wrote to them to tell them that I was planning on, I wanted to do social work. I want to be a social worker. And I applied to a few universities to study social work. Because of my criminal record, I was like rejected from all the universities, and I was like, oh my God, like I'd be an amazing social worker. There's not enough men in social work anyway, and I know a lot of the issues. I didn't really know what backup course to pick, so I picked criminology. I was like, well, I've lived a life of crime up until this point, been in prison. Maybe if I'm going to start campaigning around some of these issues, if I go and study criminology, I can attach my lived experience with a theoretical underpinning as well. And that put me in a good position to commentate going forward or whatever. And so I told them that I was going to study criminology. And then that's when they got back in touch through the mediators, practitioners, that they were ready to meet me face to face. And this was 2.5 years from that first bit of correspondence, 2.5 years. And I guess it was because of the work that I'd done in that 2.5 years and the things that I had achieved in that short space of time, that they felt they could trust me. So they felt comfortable meeting me face to face at this point. And then we arranged to meet face to face, which was surreal.
I can't even imagine what you talk about in that first meeting.
Well, what we did do is, because up until that point we'd had these conversations through practitioners, through mediation. So we did it all again.
Right.
But face to face.
So the whole, from the beginning, all the original talking
not exactly the original questions, but them telling me how what had happened to them had affected them. So I mean, in terms of like funeral and all that kind of stuff. So now I was there, it was important for them to be able to say it to my face.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? And I guess I wanted to hear it as well, or I needed to hear it. Yeah, we went into that meeting and I arrived there, and these are like awkward smiles, by the way.
No, I get it.
But
you said to me outside,
and also
before,
because it was a good, although it was a really difficult experience, it was also a life-changing experience as well.
But you said to me outside about how people sometimes pick up on how you react and make comments on it. But I think we meet so many people who've lived so many complex experiences, and the thing is, like, you just can't. It's not the film. It's not the movies where there's a way of reacting, like humans react in ways that they can't always predict. Yeah. It's something that's clear. So I get what you're saying, that sometimes when people smile or have the reaction is not connected to happiness. Sometimes it might be, but often it can be awkwardness or shock or So, but please carry on.
The practitioners that we kind of knew really well by this point, because they've been on this journey with us for the whole 2.5 years.
Oh, the same ones?
Yeah, wow. Same ones. And it's important to keep the same ones, just so that you can carry through everything. And they was at either side, and then they told me, to my face, what James was like as a person, what his personality was like, the things he enjoyed doing in life. Again, the impact that he had on them and their family. And obviously, I didn't really quite know what to do. I was just taking it all in, obviously. I find it really hard to like make eye contact with them, and I was like tearing up, and but again, I wanted to hear it, because sometimes you can hide behind not knowing, and so you never take responsibility, because you never knew the true impact of how you made other people feel. Yeah, hearing it all again 2.5 years later from them sat across the table from me was a surreal experience, and kind of just cemented why I was doing exactly what I was doing up until that point. And then once they'd covered that, we moved the conversation towards, you know, how I was getting on over the last couple of years, what my hopes were for university. And then we agreed in that meeting that we wanted to raise awareness together, that a single punch can kill.
What's your relationship like now with the parents of James?
As things stand, it's a little bit like how it's always been, really, in terms of me keeping them posted on, you know, life, maybe quarterly or yearly or whatever just feels appropriate from my point of view. But my email or phone is always open for them. But I feel like I'm a little bit more hesitant the other way around, if that makes sense. Like, I won't communicate more than I feel that I need to, but I'm always open for any correspondence from them, if that makes sense.
It's so interesting talking to you, because obviously it wasn't one single thing, but you know, from the beginning of the conversation, it feels like a lot of your issues and challenges early on were sort of triggered by education and the fact everyone's going through a single system, and you felt out on the outside of it, kept getting excluded, playing up, thought you couldn't do it because of your diagnosis. But the way you talk is so, you know, you sound like a very intelligent person when you speak, and it's that kind of thing where it feels like there's a bit of tragedy in the fact that if you'd been in a different position, it might have all been so different.
And that's why I'm so passionate about what it is that I talk about, because in essence it is all just communication. You know, both the communication between the teachers and me, communication between me and my mum, communication between me and my dad, or absence of it. It took for lots of tragedy to happen, and then for me to have good, healthy communication with the people I'd harmed the most, for me to start learning how to communicate myself.
I mean, we did a video before together with LADbible and yourself, and I think as a team we were all quite struck by the positivity in the comments, because I think what that video did was, when you read the title and you go into it with a massive assumption about what that person is who could do that kind of thing. And you go on the journey and you just realise that, you know, one of the comments I saw that stood out to me is that you've got a life sentence, in a sense that you can see that you know, it's a big weight on you still when you talk about it. And a lot of young people, there were a lot of comments in there as well where young people are saying like, God, this guy should come and talk to me and my mates and all that kind of thing. And we have a big youth audience. What is it that you want to communicate to young people watching this who can see themselves in the position that you were in just before the event that ultimately changed the direction of your life?
Don't wait for your lives to become tragic before you make better decisions.
It's been a pleasure having you back. Really appreciate your time, and I know it takes a lot to speak about this thing, so we do appreciate it. Thanks, man.
84 charges they wanted to arrest me for, because they made each separate hack a charge.
Right.
If they want to charge you 84 times, they have to arrest you 84 times. And then that means they have to caution you 84 times. But they only did it for half the charges, for 40 of the charges, because they could only hold me for 24 hours.